Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Alien Minds, written by crumjd. There was a lot of excitement in the telepathic buzz of the Turks' ambassadorial corps as the human ship drew close. Even the chargé d'affaires was broadcasting more than a bit of excitement, and normally he liked to maintain an air of utter unflappability. Still, who could blame him? The humans were really exciting. First off, it seemed like they might be mentally compatible with the Turks' psychology. That level of compatibility was rare, not just for the Turks, but for any race. In fact, it was more common for two species to be so different they couldn't even agree on the basic facts of the universe, find names for all of each other's emotions, or agree on absolutely basic standards of behavior and morality. Trade between species could exist, but it was carried out by trained and closely supervised personnel. For the most part, that was as close as the two races could get. Of course, some worlds existed where different species mingled, but they typically managed that by simply foregoing all laws. The resultant societies never lasted long. They'd become havens for drug production, child slavery, silverware misuse, or clock manufacture, and eventually a more powerful polity would grasp them. That was a shame. When two species could get along well enough to work or even live side by side, they reaped enormous benefits. To start, they doubled their territory and military might overnight. Longer term, there were tremendous economic and scientific rewards as the different aptitudes of the races meshed. That was why the ambassadorial corps ended up acting like a bunch of deranged matchmakers forever searching for the one. To overextend that metaphor, matching with humans would be like finding a real love connection with a beautiful heiress who had a great sense of humor. Human technology was just incredible. They were one of those races that could build things of mind-boggling complexity. The ship the ambassadorial corps was meeting with was a good example. They contained weapons, conference rooms, crew rec facilities, and much besides. The Turks couldn't even translate the language of most races that built ships like that. Cricri was distracted from the thought by the appearance of the objects of his professional affection walking through the semi-permanent passage that connected the Cricri and human ships while negotiations were ongoing. The young engineer didn't broadcast his first emotion upon seeing them. They definitely were only like beautiful heiress metaphorically. Cricri had known that they were bipedal and bilaterally symmetrical. He'd even seen pictures and videos of them. But in person, it just looked wrong. They were so stretched out and unstable looking. If one of them stopped balancing for even an instant, they'd surely collapsed instantly. Not that it seemed to bother them. Cricri had assumed they'd move by sliding their feet forward, but no. They had a stride similar to the Turks, lifting a foot entirely off the ground to move it. In fact, it didn't stop there. They'd seemed quite content to take both feet off the ground and just jump or fall forward. For a moment, Cricri tried to work out the calculus of it, but that was a losing proposition. Broadly speaking, their limbs were first-class levers, and they moved a bit like an inverted pendulum, but it was all too irregular. They moved their arms and legs and even centers of mass as they walked, throwing off the balance of their movement. Or rather, it would have thrown off that balance, but they shifted at tiny increments so smoothly that they never wavered. He couldn't keep up with it at all, and for the first time, Cricri wondered if he'd been handed an impossible task. He was supposed to figure out how they built the mighty ships. He was wondering if they did it by being way smarter than the Turks. It doesn't affect the weapons. Cricri was no expert in human vocal patterns, but even his limited training said the engineer he was talking to was angry. Well, that was fine. Cricri was also pissed. When he stepped aboard the ship, he'd been given a small device to translate his telepathic broadcast to something a human could understand. At the moment, it hung dull and unlit at his breast, or rather, it glowed in a portion of the near-infrared that humans could see, but Turks couldn't. That color meant anger to humans. It is an electrical system. Of course it has an impact on your other electrical systems. The weapons are isolated. They have their own power plants then. What? No, I mean, they have backups, but I already showed you the annihilation generator. It runs everything. Then what do your words mean? If they are interconnected, he meshed his phalanges, then they affect one another. He wiggled some of the phalanges, but not others. They all moved. The telepathy converter had shifted to a deep green. Confusion. Okay, sure. They are linked after a fashion. I mean, I guess a big enough shock to the third cargo bay auxiliary lighting could, hypothetically, propagate to the weapons systems. But what you're talking about? The humans trailed off. His expression now looked exactly like the pre-mission examples of confusion. Cree broadcast an emotion that his translator couldn't handle, causing it to ripple in a quick rainbow pattern. On the one plate, it was astounding to be moving in such mental sync with such an alien being. But at the balancing plate, the humans seemed utterly mad. Or at least their engineers were. He hadn't dealt with the cooks or lawyers. Apparently, the cooks and lawyers were great. The cooks had worked with the medical and biological science officers of both sides and come up with foods everyone could eat, blended out of the traditional ingredients of both races. The lawyers, meanwhile, were pounding out a simple framework of law that would allow trade and military support almost instantly, while simultaneously holding the potential to be extended to full joint colonization or an exchange of citizens. Cree learned about this during the weekly meeting of the diplomatic mission, and it made him resentful, being the only black mark in the otherwise glowing field of shiny progress in the Charged Affairs broadcast inquiry, and asked, "And engineering?" "The humans are, they are friendly, happy to answer all questions, quite comfortable to interact with. I feel I'm already starting to learn their methods of nonverbal communication. I feel there is nothing that should hold up our relations." "Yes, but their technology." Cree held back from broadcasting his frustrations for a long moment before deciding he might as well be honest and letting it go in a rush that made everyone else at the meeting lean away from him. "They're nuts. I don't know if it's some manner of obfuscation or something deeper, but they can't seem to answer any question about how their technology works. I mean, they can tell me the concepts easily enough, but if I try to get into interactions with interrelations, they spout madness. I asked, for example, how the forward armor impacts the integrity of the main conference room, and the human just looked at me as if my words didn't translate." Cree drew a deep breath and continued, "However, he did understand the words because he said what they always say. It doesn't. Which is crazy because that conference room is the biggest void in their ship, and the armor is the heaviest part of the ship, and it's nearly as far as you can get from the main thrusters. The combination of factors must be the biggest structural issue in the whole ship." "I presumed you explained that." "I shouldn't have had to. It's very basic engineering. Still, I pointed it out and asked again, but he just talked about load-bearing structures and whatnot, and how they were strong enough with or without the room. It was as though you shouldn't even think about a great whacking void in the middle of your ship when designing all that." The Charged Affairs admitted mild consternation and disappointment. "Still, you say it's not an issue. Let us know if it becomes one." Later, Cree held his telepathic translator up to his guide. Perhaps the human could describe it without resorting to nonsense. "Tell me, how does this work then?" It went blue, reflecting the curiosity that he was sending out. "Okay, sure. That's really simple. Your telepathy isn't anything terribly complex. You just broadcast your emotional state in a low-frequency amplitude modulated radio waves, so that," he gestured at the device, "is basically an antenna, a programmable chip, and a screen hooked together. That's simple. It practically frequency shifts your sendings without an intermediary." Yes. But more specifically, tell me about the battery, the antenna, and the screen." The human shrugged. That was a gesture the Tuskers couldn't translate. It almost seemed to herald their madness. Something along the lines of, "That's a detail I'll disregard for no reason. I intend to explain." And indeed, the human answered, "They're standard." "How can that be? You've only built 20 or so of these things. Are you telling me that you already have them standardized?" "Oh, of course not. They're standard for other things. I think the antenna is from a mobile. A battery is standard flash rechargeable solid-state electrolyte. The screen is thin film OLED, normally sold for disposable displays. The antenna hooks into the display and the battery with a programmable board, normally sold to hobbyists. We 3D printed the plastic parts. You're saying that none of the major parts were designed to work together? The man shrugged. Cree had to suppress the urge to punch him. Not specifically, the man answered at length. In a general way they are. That makes no sense. Here. Cree opened the battery compartment and eyed the wiring on the back of the battery. If I'm reading your language correctly, this is a 6.8 volt, 4,200 milliamp hour battery. Are you saying that the board takes 6.8 volts of power, and the ideal duty cycle for the screens was structured around 4,200 milliamps? The board was a little lower power, if I recall correctly, but we put in a resistor, and a 4,200 is actually a bit much for the screens. It probably hasn't run low on you yet, and it's kind of heavy. All right, so these things perform rather poorly as a system, but you just sort of slapped them together, Cree said in triumph. Here now, they worked well enough. The human sounded offended. Cree was rather proud of himself for picking that up from the being's tone. He also didn't blame him. No engineer wanted to have their work insulted, and this one knew enough of the details of the emotional translators that Cree suspected he had been on the design of the device. He was quick to soothe. No, I agree. They're quite ingenious, and it is a marvelous way to solve an engineering problem. It's just... Cree looked down at his translator to see a new color suffused it as he broadcast a pulse of fear. I'm beginning to believe that you might have built your whole ship this way. What? With standard batteries, resistors and such? How else would you build a ship? Those parts are... The human trailed off, looking for a metaphor, which apparently found. They're like parts of a body. What? How? Well, okay, you've got a hand. The human looked at Cree's hand, which, admittedly, wasn't terribly similar to the human's from a morphological perspective. A sort of hand, anyways. Now, when you want to pick something up, you don't estimate its weight, estimate just how much force it'll take to propel your hand over to it, calculate what it'll take to pull your hand back with the object, figure out that the weight and the effort will do to your body as a whole, and how much oxygen you'll burn by picking it up, and then start breathing heavily if you're going to need more air. You use your hand to pick the thing up, and everything else just handles itself. Cree was silent for a long time. He blinked 7 times, keeping his eyes lubricated. He took 27 breaths, and his heart beat 35 times. He broadcast confusion, and made the translator around his neck glow a perfect green. At length, he stated, That is exactly what I do. The human engineer had hurried them both to the medbay in an attempt to find the ship's doctor while he explained the concepts he only half understood. Humans, it turned out, had 2 forms of muscle, 2 nervous systems, and different parts of the brain to control different parts of the body. Even what they did control, they barely thought about. They didn't do any calculus to move, or consciously estimate the weights of things they wanted to move beyond light and heavy. Humans were practically symbiotes in their own bodies, and it was deeply creepy. So wait, you can close your eyelids intentionally, but when you blink, you don't think about it? Cree asked the doctor. Well, now I'm going to have to for the next few minutes. The engineer's complaint illuminated exactly nothing. Yes, the doctor answered. Then he asked a question of his own. You still control basic processes in your sleep? Of course. Their breathing and heartbeats were all just really experienced when they were asleep. That and the slow automatic sifting of memories and experience from the previous day. Cree broadcast a pulse of discomfort and the idea of sleeping without that connection to the physical world. How would one distinguish between their distorted memories and reality? But surely you have automatic reactions. Cree pulsed an affirmative. Chemical things. I don't explicitly control the production of enzymes and acids in my digestive system. They're produced by glands that react to the presence or absence of sugars and whatnot. Electrically signal things, those I must think about. Wait, the engineer said, raising his voice to signal excitement. Cree wondered if he even considered his tone before adopting it. If you have to think about all that stuff all the time, like the interactions between your heart and your legs and your balance and everything, is that why you were always bugging me about crazy interactions in unrelated ship systems? They are not. Yeah, I get that. But to us, they sort of are. I mean, your ankle bone is connected to your shin bone and all of that. But we don't really think about that all the time, and that's how we build our ships. But ye do think about it. Cree considered, then bobbed his head in a way that he hoped the humans would interpret as a nod. Just so, I suppose. We do break big problems down into smaller parts, but not so compulsively as you. And seeing it all as a system, that's what makes your tiny ship so insanely performant and durable. We thought you had tech or tricks that we didn't, but you probably just work out every last interaction. And how you understand the mad labyrinths you piled up. The human let out a long, low whistle. It was some sort of emotional expression, presumably a potent one, not one Cree had been trained in. The human clarified somewhat by speaking, "Think about what we could do together. I bet your species could work bugs out that we'd never see out of their designs, or could even suggest some truly impressive improvements." Cree did his nod-like thing again. You would see ways around problems that would block us for years, or even cause the project to be abandoned. We couldn't have built the telepathic translators so quickly. Cree elevated his heart rate and breathing to oxygenate the compounds rushing into his blood as his excitement triggered a fight or flight response. A union between species would be very but as extraordinary as the diplomatic corps had dreamed, and then some. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.